The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the raw plywood of the scaffolding still held the heavy, damp scent of the storm. Jake Sullivan stood at the very edge of the platform, the metal railing cool against his side. With his clipboard braced against his forearm, he looked down, his gaze instantly finding Kate Simmons. She was standing below, bathed in the warm, amber glow of the string lights draped across the nearby fundraiser tent, studying the blueprints spread over a temporary folding table. The orange light caught the edges of her hair, creating a soft halo that seemed entirely out of place amidst the mud and steel of the construction site. A man from the Chamber of Commerce passed near her, his steps slowing as his eyes darted between Kate and Jake. He lingered for a beat too long, assessing the silent space between them, before offering a knowing, quiet smile and walking on into the shadows. Jake felt the weight of that look, felt it in the sudden tightness of his chest. He took half a step back, retreating slightly into the darkness. "Careful," he said, his voice low, pitched only for her to hear over the distant murmur of the crowd. "People would think we're together." Kate didn't look away from him. Her eyes, bright and searching, held his. "Would that be so bad?" she asked softly. Neither of them answered. Behind them, the Arkansas River kept moving, its dark water churning in a steady, ancient rhythm, just as it always had. Before the rest of their story unfolds, sit with that question for a second. What would you have said if you were standing exactly where Jake was standing, holding a decade of ghosts in your chest? 6 weeks earlier, the river had carried the deep, moody color of late October, a restless gray-green at the edges, deceptively calm on the surface. It was the kind of current that hid its true, violent speed until you had already stepped a little too close to the edge. On the north bank, a rusted chain-link fence stretched along 4 acres of cleared mud and gravel where Riverside Commons was supposed to rise. It was designed to be a beautiful public promenade, with retail spaces lining the water and a sweeping footbridge meant to connect 2 historically divided neighborhoods that hadn't had a reason to speak to one another in 30 years. It had been Kate's father's dream long before it became hers, first sketched on the back of a greasy diner napkin 20 years ago, and eventually handed down to her along with a proud company name and a crushing debt load that never slept. But Simmons' Riverside Group was already 3 months behind on the Phase 2 permitting. To make matters worse, the site supervisor who had run the crew since groundbreaking had walked off the job without warning, citing his failing heart and his doctor's urgent warnings in the very same breath. Kate desperately needed someone who could read a complex structural drawing without needing a single line explained twice. She needed someone who could start Monday morning, and most of all, someone who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about why a tight schedule had suddenly become entirely impossible. Jake Sullivan fit 2 of those requirements perfectly. The third one, however, he broke within his first hour on the job. He showed up for the interview in a faded canvas jacket with a torn cuff, arriving 40 minutes early. Instead of coming inside, he sat quietly in his truck in the gravel parking lot, waiting until the exact minute of his appointment before stepping through the door. Kate's assistant had handed her his 1-page resume. There was no polished cover letter, and his work history jumped abruptly from a defunct engineering firm straight into a decade of minor residential remodels, leaving a massive, unexplained gap in between. Kate had almost set the paper aside based on that gap alone. But then, her eyes caught the margins of the site plan she had emailed him the night before. He had covered them in small, incredibly precise pencil notes. A load calculation was flagged with a tiny question mark, followed by a corrected figure. When Kate checked the math later, she found he was absolutely correct. She hired him on a 90-day contract before she had even finished her morning coffee, stubbornly telling herself it was strictly because of those brilliant margin notes and nothing else. On her way out that afternoon, her assistant casually mentioned that the reference Jake had listed, a tiny, family-owned remodeling outfit 2 counties over, had described him in exactly 4 words: shows up, does it right. There was no embellishment, no explanation of the missing years. Kate found that blunt, honest praise far more convincing than any glowing paragraph of corporate jargon could have been. Jake's days began long before the sun rose. By 5:30 a.m. in his small, rented house on the east side of Tulsa, he was already packing a lunchbox for his 9-year-old daughter, Grace. As he made sandwiches, Grace would narrate, at length and with immense, wide-eyed seriousness, the plot of a book she was reading about a heroic dog who solved neighborhood crimes. Jake listened to her the way he did most things now, fully, with his entire soul, never rushing her toward the door. He still tied her shoes when she let him, a rare occurrence now that she was 9, and fiercely insisted on doing it herself, even if it took twice as long and ended in a tangled knot. He never hurried those moments either. He knew how quickly they were slipping away. But the moment he stepped onto the job site, he became someone else. He wasn't cold, just deeply contained. Like a man who had learned through hard experience exactly how much of himself was safe to bring to work. Every morning, before the crew clocked in, he walked the frozen mud of the excavation perimeter, checking stakes and grade markers against a detailed mental map he seemed to carry effortlessly. When Kate came out for her first full walkthrough, her leatherwork boots still looking far too clean for the thick mud clinging to them, she quietly watched him catch a subtle rebar spacing error that everyone else had missed. The crew grew to respect him quickly. Men on a job site learned to love a supervisor who doesn't waste their mornings with empty speeches. Jake kept a large thermos of hot black coffee on his truck tailgate for anyone who forgot theirs, quietly guided the younger workers who were still learning how to read a level, and never made a show of correcting a mistake in front of the others. By the end of his first week, nobody on the site called him the new guy anymore. "You used to do this for a living," Kate said to him one afternoon. "It wasn't a question." "A long time ago," Jake replied quietly, already moving toward the next survey stake before she could ask which living he meant, or why on earth he had walked away from it. That night, sitting alone at her kitchen table with a stack of unopened mail beside her, Kate found herself opening the small leather journal she kept for things truly worth remembering, a habit she had inherited from her father. She had rarely used it for anyone on her cruise, but tonight, she wrote Jake's name on a blank page. She didn't let herself analyze why she was making an exception for him. She closed the notebook, told herself it was purely about his sharp eye for rebar, and knew, deep down, that she was lying to herself. Over the next few weeks, their interactions rarely exceeded 20 or 30 words a day. It was always strictly professional. A question about a grade elevation, a brief note about incoming rain delays, the quiet rhythm of a job site settling in under a competent leader. Should have stayed there, but a silent, unacknowledged gravity was pulling them closer, even if neither of them dared to voice it. Kate's father, in the years before he died, had left her with a golden rule about leadership. Watch how a man treats the people who can do absolutely nothing for him. One afternoon, Kate watched from her trailer window as Jake crouched down in the dirt to explain a grading stake to a 19-year-old laborer, a quiet kid who was constantly ignored by the older hands. Jake took the exact same time and care with him as he would have with a senior partner from a major engineering firm. She didn't tell Jake she had seen him do it, but she carried the warmth of that image with her all day. The weekly technical review meeting for Phase 2 ran grueling hours behind schedule, largely because the Dallas firm's junior engineer kept trying to defend a flawed load calculation. Jake sat quietly at the very back of the room, his arms crossed, saying absolutely nothing until the numbers projected on the screen began to warp into something he could no longer ignore. "That live load figure is off," Jake said. His voice wasn't loud, but the room went instantly cold and quiet anyway. You're applying a retail occupancy factor across the entire footprint. But the second floor is residential adjacent. That falls under an entirely different section of the building code. The junior engineer flushed, hurriedly flipping through his thick binder. He found the discrepancy buried deep on page 3, and all the color drained from his face. Kate watched the exchange from the head of the long table, her arms folded. She let Jake finish without interrupting, knowing instinctively that her silent trust meant more to him than any verbal agreement would have. Near the window, a younger engineer, a recent graduate still carrying the bright, unbattered enthusiasm of someone new to the industry, stared intensely at Jake, squinting as if trying to place a legendary face. "Wait," the young man said, his voice rising. "Sullivan? Sullivan Marsh? Did you co-write the definitive load path retrofit paper? We literally studied that in graduate school. I thought you had retired or passed away." Jake didn't answer immediately. He slowly closed his black binder with deliberate, quiet care, the way a man closes a heavy door he has no intention of opening again. "Different lifetime," he said simply. That was the end of the conversation in the room, but under the table, 3 different people were already typing furiously on their phones. The Dallas firm's senior partner dialed in on the speakerphone, went completely silent for so long that Kate had to check if the call had dropped. When he finally spoke again, his voice was entirely stripped of its usual territorial arrogance. It was careful, measured, the tone of a man realizing he was dealing with an intellectual giant. Jake didn't seem to care, or if he did, he didn't let it show. He was already turning the page to review the drainage plans. After the meeting adjourned, Kate caught up with him in the quiet hallway outside, holding 2 cups of steaming coffee. "You co-wrote a methodology they teach in graduate schools," she said softly, keeping her voice low so it wouldn't echo down the corridor. "And yet you're out here in the mud checking rebar spacing for a company that pays you by the day." Jake took the cup from her hand, his fingers briefly brushing hers, sending a quiet jolt through them both. "There are things I'm not legally free to talk about," he said quietly, looking down at the dark liquid. "It's not because I don't want to. It's a legal boundary. But the short version is entirely true. I need to be near my daughter far more than I need to be sitting at a drafting table in some high-rise." It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. And Kate, who had spent her entire career learning to spot the difference between the two in boardrooms full of professional liars, chose not to push him. But she couldn't stop thinking about it. Alone in her office late that night, she pulled his physical application file from the bottom drawer. Under the section labeled "Reason for Leaving Previous Position," Jake had started to write something in his tight, neat handwriting, but had then crossed it out so violently that the ballpoint pen had torn clean through the paper. She couldn't make out the words, but she could see the raw force of the strokes. It told her more about his pain than any completed sentence ever could have. She closed the file, slid it back into the drawer, and resolved to wait until he was ready to tell her himself. Looking out her window, she saw him in the dim light of the yard, checking the tie-downs on the heavy machinery one last time before leaving. He was a man who trusted absolutely nothing, not even his own shadow, until he had verified it with his own hands. Simmons Riverside had sponsored the school district's annual STEM night for 3 years, but Kate had never expected to see Jake Sullivan walking the crowded gymnasium in his scuffed work boots, holding a flimsy paper plate of sugar cookies he clearly didn't want but was too polite to discard. Kate was there because her company's logo was printed on the banner hanging behind the elaborate volcano displays, because her father always believed a local business owed its community more than just taxes, and because it was a lonely Tuesday night. She found Jake standing proudly at the edge of a folding table, displaying his daughter's project. A model bridge meticulously built from popsicle sticks and wood glue. Grace had tested it that morning with a bucket of pennies, recording the weight it held with immense pride in a marbled composition notebook. "You must be the sponsor lady," Grace announced confidently before either adult could speak. "My dad said you're his boss. Are you going to fire him if his bridge is bad?" Because it held 2 full pounds more than the winning table. Kate smiled warmly, crouching down to meet the little girl's eyes. She studied the tiny wooden bridge with as much intensity as if it were a multi-million-dollar blueprint. "I think your dad's job is very, very safe," Kate whispered. Grace beamed, her chest swelling with pride. Standing a few feet back, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, Jake watched them. For the first time, his face was entirely unguarded and soft. This was the version of Jake that usually remained hidden at home, easy, warm, and deeply devoted. "She gets her stubbornness from her mother?" Jake said softly as Grace ran off to show her science notebook to a classmate. "The bridge building, though, that might be my fault." Kate stood up, looking at the bridge. "It's a beautiful bridge, Jake," she said, her voice carrying a weight that went far beyond popsicle sticks and glue. A teacher stopped by to admire the design, looking between Jake and Kate with a curious, lingering gaze before moving on. It was a look they had both started receiving more often lately, though neither had dared to name it. "Popsicle sticks can hold a lot more weight than people think," Jake said, trying to fill the sudden, charged silence the teacher had left behind. "It's the same basic principle as structural steel, just slower to fail. If you're paying attention, it always gives you warning signs first." Kate looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. "Is that a metaphor, Jake? Or just an engineering fact?" He offered a faint, devastatingly handsome smile. "Depends on which one you need to hear tonight." Later, walking to her car under a bruising, purple twilight sky, Kate couldn't stop thinking about that unguarded version of him. She wished she could see him like that more often. The next morning, back in the quiet sanctuary of the site trailer, Jake was pulling the Phase 1 inspection binder to prepare a compliance summary for the city. Out of sheer, deeply ingrained habit, his eyes scanned the signature block on the foundation certification page. The date was off by 9 days compared to every other document in the sequence. It was a tiny discrepancy, the kind of clerical slip that usually meant absolutely nothing. He tried to tell himself that, sliding the binder back onto the shelf. He walked out to inspect the afternoon's concrete pour, but a persistent, cold feeling in his gut refused to let him believe his own excuses. By 9 p.m. that night, the two of them were still in the office, working through the Phase 2 structural package line by line. Boxes of takeout food sat cold and forgotten between massive stacks of blueprints. Jake finally reached over and pulled the foundation certification sheet again. This time, he cross-referenced the engineer's stamp against the city's active registry of approved inspection vendors. The firm's registration stamp did not match any active inspector on the list. It wasn't an expired license or a simple typo. It was a ghost name, a firm that, as far as the city of Tulsa was concerned, did not exist. He kept quiet for a moment. He wanted to be absolutely certain before he dumped another catastrophic problem onto Kate's already crowded desk. But she noticed the sudden, heavy silence. "Jake? What's wrong?" "Nothing," he lied smoothly, deflecting. "Just a minor formatting issue. I'll get it sorted." To steer her away from the papers, he asked her about her father. It was an easy detour, as Kate loved talking about the man who had built her world. She smiled softly, her eyes distant. "He built Simmons Riverside out of a rusty truck and a 2-person office," she said, looking down at her hands. "He used to bring me to the sites on Saturday mornings. He'd let me hold the level like it was a sacred relic. I inherited a company that half the industry still thinks I don't deserve." Some days, I almost believe them. Jake looked up, his eyes steady and intense. You corrected a major rebar spacing error on your very first walk through while wearing heels. They were flats, she laughed softly. Still counts, Jake said, his voice dropping to a warm, comforting register. Kate rubbed her eyes, exhaustion heavy in her bones. My father always said the job never asks what you're wearing. It only asks if you're paying attention. He sounds like a man I would have loved to work for. He was incredibly hard to work for, Kate admitted, a tender smile touching her lips. But he was very easy to love, just not always at the same time. She told him about the first ribbon-cutting ceremony she remembered, a small strip mall that, to an 8-year-old girl, felt like the grandest palace on earth. He made me hold the giant scissors even though the mayor's assistant was furious about it. He told me if I was going to run the place one day, I'd better start practicing. I didn't realize back then that inheriting a company mostly means inheriting everyone else's doubts about you. Kate, you've corrected more structural errors on this site in 6 weeks than the last 3 supervisors did in a year, Jake said firmly. That's not a doubt you should be carrying anymore. Tell that to the board. I did, Jake said quietly. This afternoon. In writing. Kate looked up, her breath catching. A sudden, sweet warmth bloomed in her chest. A feeling of being protected that she hadn't felt in a very long time. She laughed, a genuine, breathless sound. And for a fleeting moment, the deep exhaustion vanished from both of their faces. Jake almost told her right then. He almost told her about the tragedy, about the name Marsh, and about why his hands still remembered every load path formula even though he had sworn he would never design another structure. Instead, he simply whispered, I used to think I could keep the people I cared about safe with numbers alone. But I learned the hard way that numbers only work if the person in charge is actually willing to listen to them. Kate felt the immense gravity of his words, sensing the deep pain beneath them, and chose to just sit with him in the quiet rather than forcing him to explain. Outside, the river ran like liquid silver under the pale crescent moon. There's a fundraiser this Saturday, Kate said finally, breaking the silence as she rolled up a blueprint. Riverside hosts it every year at the halfway point of the build. You should bring Grace. I think she's earned a night off from volcano judging. Jake looked at her, the warmth in her eyes impossible to resist. We'll be there, he said softly. The fundraiser tent was erected right on the riverbank, near the spot where the footbridge would eventually rise. Warm string lights crisscrossed overhead, and a local band played a sweet, melancholic tune with a fiddle weaving through the air. Grace was a blur of joy, running between the dessert table and her friends, breathlessly explaining her dog detective books to anyone who would listen. Jake watched her from a distance, holding a cup of coffee, feeling the profound, quiet relief of a single father who, for just one night, didn't have to carry the entire weight of his child's happiness alone. Kate found him near the edge of the tent, where the music faded into the sound of the rushing river. Their conversation flowed instantly, as if they were just continuing a chat they'd been having their whole lives. She asked about his knee, which he'd been subtly favoring all week, and he asked about her father's vintage truck, still locked away in a garage she couldn't bring herself to open. Grace's bright, echoing laughter drifted over from the dessert table. Both of them turned to look at her at the exact same moment, and when they turned back, their eyes met. They were both smiling, a natural, beautiful symmetry that caught them both off guard. You could open that garage sometime, you know, Jake said softly. It doesn't have to mean you're moving on, just letting some fresh air in. I know, Kate whispered, stepping a fraction closer to him. I'm just not there yet. No rush, he said. The way he said it made her believe him. He wasn't a man who kept score of how long it took for hearts to heal. A prominent businessman Kate had known since her university days strolled past, slowing his steps. He looked at how closely they were standing, his eyes moving from Jake's worn boots to Kate's soft expression. He raised an eyebrow in a silent, knowing salute and walked on. Jake felt the judgment of the gaze instantly. The protective walls he had built over a decade slammed back down. He took half a step back, breaking the spell. "Careful," he murmured, his voice tight. "People would think we're together." Kate didn't retreat. She held his gaze, her voice steady and full of a quiet courage. "Would that be so bad?" Neither of them answered. But later, as they walked a sleepy grace to his truck, the headlights cutting through the gravel dust, Jake finally told her. He told her about the fake foundation certification, the unregistered firm, and the dates that made no sense. He hadn't planned to tell her there, with his daughter half asleep in the back seat, but the absolute trust he felt for Kate washed over him, overriding his caution. Kate's face went serious, her eyes turning fierce and protective. "We verify this completely before we say a word to anyone," she said. "No accusations until we have undeniable proof." Jake nodded. It was exactly the level-headed, strong response he had hoped for. From the shadows near the edge of the parking lot, Dennis Reeves watched them walk away together. He watched the way the CEO, who used to defer to him on everything, now stood close to the quiet supervisor. Dennis finished his drink slowly, a cold, bitter feeling pooling in his stomach. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, but he didn't believe it. The small town of Jenks sat 20 minutes south along the river. As Jake stood on Walt Hendrick's back porch, he could see the same white limestone bluffs he used to study from a job site 10 years ago, back when he and Walt worked the same steel and trusted the same mathematical laws. Walt answered the door in a faded flannel shirt, his reading glasses pushed up into his thick gray hair. He stared at Jake for a long, silent moment before cracking a small smile. "Took you long enough," he said, as if they had just seen each other yesterday. They sat at Walt's wooden kitchen table over 2 mugs of untouched coffee. Jake laid out the evidence, the forged signature, the fake company name, the timeline that didn't fit. Walt listened in absolute silence, the deep, observant quiet of an old foreman who could see the shape of a storm before the first raindrop fell. "You're still doing things the hard way, aren't you?" Walt said when Jake finished. "Double-checking every bolt and calculation before you let yourself sleep. You learned that from your own conscience, Jake. I just had the good sense not to talk you out of it back then, and I'm sure as hell not starting now." Walt stood up, walked to a dusty hallway closet, and returned with a cardboard box that had been taped shut for nearly 10 years. He reached inside and pulled out a faded manila folder. Jake recognized it instantly. It was a duplicate of the original inspection report from the catastrophic project that had destroyed his career and his life. Walt had kept a copy off the record because the official story had never sat right with him, even after the lawsuits were settled and the world had moved on. "Look at the firm name," Walt said, sliding a dusty page across the table. "Different name on the letterhead, but look at the signature on the stamp. It's the exact same handwriting. They never actually stopped doing business, Jake. They just changed their name, got a new coat of paint, and kept right on signing off on bad concrete." Jake stared at the signature until the ink seemed to bleed together. 10 years of running, and the exact same ghost had found him again. This time it was on a project where his own daughter would walk. "If this is real," Jake's voice was barely a whisper, thick with sudden, suffocating emotion. "It means the exact same people whose fake reports got my wife killed are signing off on Kate's foundation right now." "Then you already know what you have to do," Walt said, his eyes hard. "Don't let them bury you a second time, son." Jake drove back to Tulsa with the folder resting on the passenger seat like a live explosive. He didn't call Kate, he drove straight to her house. Some things couldn't be whispered over a phone. At 9:30 p.m., he stood on her porch, holding 10 years of grief and paper under his arm. Kate opened the door, took one look at his pale, shattered face, and pulled him inside without asking a single question. This time, he didn't give her the edited version. He sat at her kitchen table and told her everything. He told her about the structural collapse that had claimed his wife's life, the warnings he had flagged that were ignored by executives who never set foot on site, the massive corporate cover-up, and the strict non-disclosure agreement that had legally bound his hands and kept him silent for a decade. He explained that talking now broke no laws, because public safety always overrides a private contract. But he had needed to see her face to truly believe he was allowed to be free of the secret. Kate listened with the folder open between them, her eyes shining with unshed tears. When he finished, she didn't offer him empty platitudes or try to minimize the pain. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said, her voice rich with a deep, fierce sincerity. "All of it, even the broken parts." "I wasn't sure I could," Jake admitted, his voice cracking. "I've been carrying this alone for so long that I forgot how to let anyone else help." "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," Kate said softly. She reached across the table, her hand covering his shaking fingers, holding them steady. Before the warmth of her touch could even fade, Kate picked up her phone and called the independent engineering firm the city kept on retainer for emergencies, initiating a full, immediate audit of the foundation before Jake had even finished his coffee. "If Dennis is behind this," Kate said, her eyes turning to ice as she closed the folder, "I will be the one who tears his career apart, piece by piece, in front of everyone who ever trusted him." The board convened on a tense Thursday morning. 10 members sat around a mahogany table that had seen many difficult meetings, but none quite like this. The independent inspection results had arrived at midnight, and Kate had read them 3 times before she could fully process the gravity of the betrayal. Dennis Reeves arrived early, looking perfectly composed, already wearing the practiced, arrogant smile of a man who believed he was untouchable. When Kate laid the independent report on the table, the atmosphere turned frozen. Foundation load capacity, nearly 9% under code minimum. Certification stamp traced to a fraudulent successor firm. Dennis leaned back in his leather chair, a sneer playing on his lips. "This is nothing more than a disgruntled contractor trying to settle a grudge," Dennis said, his voice smooth and practiced. "He's spinning a wild conspiracy theory out of a simple clerical error that nobody bothered to double-check." Without saying a word, Jake stood up and placed Walt's dusty folder on the table. He didn't raise his voice. With a quiet, devastatingly clear authority, he walked the board members through the structural calculations page by page, showing them the exact mathematical proof with the same patient clarity he used when teaching the young laborers in the mud. He didn't mention his wife. He didn't have to. The pure, cold math carried a weight that grief alone never could. Then, the independent inspector's voice came through the speakerphone in the center of the table, confirming every single word Jake had said. The structural deviation was severe. It required an immediate emergency shutdown of the entire site. The boardroom went completely, horrifyingly still. An older woman on the board, who had served alongside Kate's father for decades, broke the silence. "How long would it have taken for us to realize this if he hadn't caught it?" The inspector's flat, clinical voice echoed through the speaker. "Depends on the weather and the load. It might have held for a few years. Or it could have suffered a catastrophic failure during the first hard freeze this winter, with hundreds of people standing on it." Nobody breathed. Kate stood up, her posture regal, her eyes blazing. "I trusted a corrupt process that I should have been policing myself," she said, looking each board member in the eyes. That failure belongs to me, not to the man who saved us. She turned her gaze to Dennis. You are terminated, effective immediately, pending a full criminal investigation by the city. Dennis's arrogant composure finally shattered. His face flushed a violent red as security guards escorted him out of the building. He looked back at Jake with a gaze full of pure, impotent rage. Jake didn't look at him. He was already carefully gathering the papers, organizing them with his usual meticulous care. It was only Kate who noticed that his hands, usually so rock-solid, were shaking violently now that the battle was won and there was no one left to be strong for. She stepped close, her shoulder brushing his, offering her silent, steady warmth until the trembling stopped. The site went completely quiet for 11 days while independent crews performed core drillings and checked every single weld. Kate spent those days locked in brutal shareholder meetings and defensive calls, protecting Jake from the board members who desperately wanted a scapegoat. One member gently suggested that she had let her personal feelings for the new supervisor cloud her professional judgment. Kate didn't flinch. I let a sense of basic human decency override a paper trail designed to hide a crime, she replied coldly. And I will never apologize for that. One afternoon, Grace ran into the site trailer and handed Kate a bright crayon drawing. It was a beautiful, sturdy bridge spanning a vibrant blue river, without a single crack in its colorful arches. She didn't explain what it meant, but she didn't need to. Kate pinned it directly above her desk, where it would stay for years. That evening, as the sun began to set, Jake and Kate sat on the grassy bank below the site. Their boots were off, their bare feet resting in the cool, damp grass. They watched the river carry the last golden rays of daylight downstream. He turned to her and finally shared the deepest, darkest part of his grief. The part he had never been able to voice to Walt, or even to himself. The worst part wasn't just that the numbers were wrong, Jake whispered, his voice thick with 10 years of unshed tears. It was that I was entirely right. I had the math. I had the proof. And yet, being right wasn't enough to save her. It didn't keep my wife alive. Kate looked at him, her heart aching for the immense, solitary burden he had carried for so long. She didn't offer a hollow phrase. Instead, she reached out, sliding her fingers into his, locking them together. It was enough to save us, Jake, she said softly, her eyes reflecting the gold of the river. You saved me. You saved the city. You don't have to carry the bridge by yourself anymore. Jake looked down at their joined hands, feeling the cold, ancient grief in his chest finally begin to thaw, replaced by a warm, sweet hope that he had never thought he'd feel again. He squeezed her hand, pulling her just a little bit closer as the river flowed peacefully into the night.